So, welcome back to part 2 of Capital, the basics or an introduction. And we just left off where I was trying to explain, and I hope you got it, about how to calculate how much of the GDP or national income can be is due to capital, right? Then I said, why are we bothering to learn this, right? This is just some boring math, right? It's accountancy, identity, right? Why should we even care about how much goes to capital, right? And one thought you might have is that, yeah, if capital is a bigger share of the economy, that means that overall people need to work less, right? And we still can make the economy grow. Isn't that a good thing? Yes, in theory that seems perfectly good. Assuming, of course, that capital is pretty evenly distributed. But what we can see in these two graphs that I've taken from Luxembourg income study data is that, unfortunately, that's not always the case. So what we see here basically here is how much of capital income tends to benefit the rich how much we have two types of income, right? Here, capital income and labor income. Now, it's a bit confusing, right? Because just now we already tried to draw this distinction between capital and labor, right? And then you say income, then now why is it that capital income? But basically what this means is that capital income is money that you make from shares or buying property or buying land and things like that, right? And then labor income is just money from employment. And you can see, because this is this is Gini coefficient, so what this basically means is that the closer to 1 it is, the much closer we are to, this is the upper bound of inequality. And then here is more equal, right? So what this means basically is that labor income, especially in 1970s, was pretty equal, right? Meaning that the poor can sort of get good distribution, right? But whenever people make money from capital, it tends to benefit almost exclusively the top tier of society. Now, interesting, as we have seen it, as we sort of see the trend just now, right, in line with the trend of economic inequality, we have seen that labor income is getting more and more unequal, right? So one question we're going to ask is how to solve this, right? How and why, right? One question we're going to ask is how and why, right? And we're going to answer that question actually in the next session, right? But before we get to labor income, and notice there's a sort of like huge steep jump, right? Especially in the UK, and that is partly got to do with policy, which we will discuss shortly. But here, the main point is to actually focus on these two things, right? You see that capital income in both these economies, US and UK, tends to be distributed almost exclusively to the rich. In other words, capital is unequally distributed. And I'm very sorry that you are seeing this in my very bad handwriting, right? Capital is unequally distributed, right? So if capital is becoming an increasingly important part of the economy and is unequally distributed, right? Inference, we are likely to get a more and more unequal economy. And that's sort of like the basic big message of Piketty's theory, which I'm going to try to show you how he gets to that conclusion through certain technical ideas. So as I already mentioned, capital is unevenly distributed, right? As the previous slide shows you, right? To say that's unevenly distributed is kind of like an understatement. It's almost always distributed towards the top tier of the society. When we say the top tier, we really mean top tier, right? Because you can see, if you remember the graph, right, it was initially like around 0.8 or the high 0.8s, right? And then it actually goes up and more, meaning that even within the top tiers of society, capital is becoming even more unequally distributed within that. And that is something we are going to discuss more in class, right? Because one of the interesting things that we're going to see potentially is that actually not only do the rich get richer, but the mega rich get richer, and the lower tiers of the rich get richer, but not as fast as the mega rich. So even within the rich, right, there can be inequalities within the rich, and then there can be large inequalities within the society. That's something we're going to look at in class. And so this idea here, what we're going to talk about is that, so why are we concerned with that equation is that if the capital income share becomes increases, right? So we saw, right, from World War I, there was an example of 15%, right? Oh, and this is much better writing from me. And then it turned into 30%, right? And if we know that income, it comes from this is let's say there is this double jump, right? And we know that income is unequally distributed, right? So we know that the rich are benefiting much more from whatever the economy, whatever rate the economy is growing, right? That means that because capital is so unequally distributed, and we have moved from an economy where for every $100, $15 go to capital. But now we kind of know that more or less every $100 that we make, $30 goes to not just the rich, but almost exclusively to the mega rich. Then there's a big problem, right? So imagine if the number comes up to 45, then that's even more concerning, right? So as the number keeps increasing, we have even more concern, because what that means is that the pie, whatever things we are producing, a lot of it is going to not just the rich, but the mega rich in effect. And this second formula sort of wants to illustrate this idea in a bit more clearer detail. So we have seen that beta is the capital income ratio. That's the one where we have 600 divided by 1 or 300 divided by 1, right? So that's the one where basically we take all the capital stock, right? We calculate all the shares in my example, and then we divide by the national income. S is the rate of savings, right? Meaning that for every $100 made in the economy, what percentage are we saving, right? So let's say the rate of savings is 5, then again we save $5. If the rate of saving is 10, then we save $10. Then G, I'm sure that most of you, as people who have more or less come into contact with Singapore education system and Singapore in general, you will know what G is. G is basically growth, right? The rate of growth, right? How much did we grow this year? 3% or negative 1.5%, whatever, right? So the first law is an accounting identity that tells us how to determine the capital income ratio, right? The share of national income that goes to capital, or is due to capital, I should say. The second law is telling us something about the long-term trend, which I already actually gave away already, right? Which is this idea that capital becomes more and more important in an economy under certain kinds of conditions. And what are those conditions? Well, the mathematical formula tells you. The mathematical formula tells you that the capital income ratio is positively related to rates of savings, meaning that the more savings you have, then this one will go up. Right, beta goes up. The more, so not the more, right? It's actually not more because it's a relative concept. It's not absolute, right? But basically the idea is that the more that the higher rate of savings, the higher beta goes up, and then the G, right, is negatively related, right? So that means that when the economy is growing, right, and then growing at a faster pace, then capital becomes it will take less of a share, right? So what this means is that in a country where you have relatively high saving rate and you have slow growth, then past savings, which is basically past accumulated wealth, right? So if you work or you save money, right, then that sort of becomes wealth, right? But also if you get wealth in a variety of ways, right, you can get inheritance, you can get gains from investments, so on, right? Basically what this means is that the past savings and the past wealth that people have, right, and the country is sort of stagnant, doesn't grow very well, then past accumulated wealth becomes increasingly important to the society, right? And you can see this mathematically, right? Because if this is low, this is slowing down, right? Then this factor, past savings, will become increasingly important. And so therefore, because this is positively related with beta, beta will become more and more important in the overall economy. So let's look at an illustration of this idea. Okay, so first thing to note is already we've mentioned that it takes time to grow wealth, right? Because you have to save money, you have to earn, and then you have to save money. Then eventually over time, as you see, right, that income, which we've seen actually here, will turn into wealth, right? So that's why for those of you who are who know about these kinds of things, for example, when you read like investment websites like Motley Fool and all that, right? They always tell you, right, like you must take a longer time horizon, 3 to 5 years, even longer, right, to sort of see how the investment grows and how to get wealthy, right? So this idea is that you turn income, whatever income might be, right, whether from parents or jobs or that, into wealth, and that sort of takes time. So we already know, as we've already seen the formula, beta equals S divided over G. And now let's suppose that the saving rate is 10%. So that means S is 10%, meaning that if S equals 10%, that means for every $100, people save $10. Okay? And now G here is 1%. Pretty sad. So under these conditions, we expect that the income capital ratio, beta, to be 10:1, right? So remember, this is about the long-term trend of beta, right? So we're gonna say that the savings rate and the beta are sort of like very closely aligned. Why is that the case? Let's look through the logic of this idea. So let's say, suppose now that the capital income ratio beta is in this year is 8:1. In last year is 8:1. Let's suppose that's the case. Then what that means that we already know saving rate is 10%. So for every $100 that is made, right, in the economy, right, you must remember, this is not just people, right, but this is like in the economy as a whole. Saving rates of 10%. So that means that because the capital income ratio is now 8:1, right, not 10:1, right, we know that for every $100 that is being made in the economy, $10 is saved somewhere in the economy, right? But the capital income ratio is 8:1, 8/1, right? So then what that means is that when the economy saves that 10%, right, it will add more than 1% to the capital stock, right? Why is that the case? Because the growth rate is 1%, right? But the capital is 8:1, right? But the savings is 10%, right? So that means definitely, right, the savings will add more than 1% to the capital, right? Because it's 8:1, right? That's what we know. No, sorry, it's not 8. Is we know that the savings rate is above the capital income ratio, and so it will add more to the capital stock. So eventually, it will settle, right? Assuming that nothing changes, assuming that the saving rates in 2021 and 2022 stay the same, and the rate of growth also stays the same, I hope not, then it will reach an equilibrium of 10:1, right? Because the savings rate eventually will just, whatever that goes in will just become the capital stock, right? The savings will become capital stock for the next year, and so on and so forth, right? So then we just keep on putting that 10%, and then if the rate of growth is the same, eventually we will reach this equilibrium of 10:1. Now suppose that the capital income ratio is 12:1, right? Then again, it will just be the opposite, right? Because if we save 10%, right, of whatever is circulating in the economy, it will only add less than 1% to the wealth, right? Because here the rate of growth is only 1% and the savings rate is 10, right? So we can expect that it only add less than 1% to the wealth. So capital stock will be less than growth, right? Again, but so eventually it will go back down to 10:1. So that's the sort of basic idea here. Now, as I already mentioned just now, right? The first law is alpha equals rate of savings times beta, and the second law tells us that beta is S over G, right? So naturally, what do, right? Well, you do some algebraic substitution, right? So if you know that these and these are the same terms, and this equals to this, you can just sum it in, right? As sort of just algebraic form substitution. So with that, we get alpha equals R rate of savings. R equals rate of return times the rate of savings over G. And then we call this Piketty's equation. Okay, so now you will ask me, what does this mean now? Right now, again, we already went through two formulas and I tried to understand this, and then now there's another one where we combine the two, right? Yes. So what in the world does this particular one mean? Well, let's see. So here, what this means is that basically, in a nutshell, the higher the value of the rate of return and the higher the rate of savings and the lower the G, right? Because that is what is being that's the denominator, right? The more income will accrue to the holders of wealth rather than those who work for a living, right? And that is what is important here, right? Which is this basic idea that as saving rates increase and economies grow at a slower pace, they can become more stagnant, wealth becomes increasingly important, right? So if you want to prevent this problem, what do? You have to try to either up R, you have to sort of like curb R, curb S, or you try to boost your rate of growth, right? Which is typically the focus of a lot of macroeconomic policy, right? And we will take a look at these other two ways of doing it in class. Okay. Now, then again, we might ask the question that we asked in the previous video, right? Which is that, is a rising capital share necessarily bad? And the answer may be that not necessarily, right? Because it assumes that, as we assumed earlier, in the beginning of this video, again return to the scenario where everyone has some capital and everyone makes some money through employment, right? Meaning, in this world, suppose that you and I have about $500,000 to buy shares, add to the capital stock. Then in this world, if the capital income ratio is increasing, capital income ratio with a dash, right, is increasing. That means the share of how much, for every $100 now, maybe imagine $60 goes to capital, right? But if everyone has capital, then that's not bad, right? It's kind of like this Oprah Winfrey situation, right? Where you get some increase in stock, you get some increase in stock, and you get some increase in stock. Everybody gets an increase in stock, right? There's nothing inherently bad about this situation, right? But of course, as we already saw, and in Piketty's data set is sort of illustrated a bit more clearly, is this idea. And he says this: in every country and every time period for which we have data, and which they have a lot of data, for at least for industrialization from the 1940s onwards, they have pretty good data. Wealth distribution within each age group, that means throughout your life cycle, right? Whether it's 18 to 35, 35 to 50, 50 to 65, right, is substantially more unequal than income distribution. In other words, what this means is that we do not live in a world where everyone gets richer, right? Because wealth is unequally distributed, more unequally distributed than income. So in other words, wealth inequality might be a pretty entrenched feature of contemporary capitalistic societies. So the problem is that if the capital income ratio keeps on increasing, we might see an amplification of pre-existing wealth inequalities. That's the sort of problem that he wants to illustrate. So what do we mean by this? And can we see this play out in the history and in the data? Well, to answer this question, I invite you to read the paper Inequality in the Long Run, especially the last few pages, the last section on it. And in class, we will discuss this more. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in class to discuss this. Hope you look forward to it. Thank you.